All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about modernizing authoritarianism. Modernizing authoritarianism is the idea that for reasons of economic development, authoritarianism is temporarily justified. Now, modernizing autocrats don't deny that democracy might be appropriate at higher levels of economic development, but at low levels of economic development, modernizing autocrats argue that dictatorship is far preferable to democracy. Why might they argue this? For one, they say that at low levels of education in society, and in societies with perhaps backward cultural attitudes, democracies at low levels of income will vote themselves into terrible policies. Second, because investment is needed for growth, and investments often come from domestic savings, democracies are unlikely to make the hard choice of sacrificing current consumption for future consumption. A strong hand is needed, therefore, to force people to save money for an industrialization push. Third, democracy is likely to tax success, and maybe rich countries can afford this, but poor countries cannot afford to redistribute too much income too soon in their development. So the legitimacy of modernizing authoritarianism is secured by realizing the promise of development. This is sometimes called technocratic legitimacy, a claim to rule based on knowledge or expertise. Philosophers might call it epistocracy. So we said that modernizing authoritarianism legitimizes its rule by its claim to superior knowledge, but it often fails to include feedback mechanisms where the public can comment on what needs to be done and then criticize what is being done poorly. Development often requires discovering and understanding the problems of people on the ground, the problems of farmers, or the problems of cities that have seen lots of people flock to them for jobs. But modernizing authoritarian regimes tend to see the population as backward and in need of education, so they tend not to listen to what the people have to say, even when they have very good points to make. Also, because it is autocratic, modernizing authoritarianism suffers from a lack of accountability. Bad decisions are not discouraged because they tend not to be punished. And finally, the non-economic dimension of well-being is largely ignored. Because the development promises a rise in incomes, modernizing authoritarian regimes have very few incentives to address other dimensions of well-being, such as health, working conditions, psychological well-being. They're much more interested in what can be measured than intangibles. Now, modernizing authoritarian regimes can take at least three major institutional forms. You have military regimes, one-party regimes, and personalistic regimes. Let's talk about each in turn. Military regimes are typically born from coup d'etat. Military leaders guard the nation from threats to development or internal struggles. Stability here is the key to sustainable development, and that goes through a strong military. Military leaders often then empower technocratic elites, so teams of economists, in other words, and bureaucrats, to run the country, and then they hold those bureaucrats accountable for their results. So one moderately successful example of this might be Pinochet's Chile. A disastrous example of military regime might be Burma or Myanmar today. Another type of modernizing authoritarian regime might be a one-party regime. Here, control is established, as it sounds like, by one party, usually the party that organized the push for independence from a former colonial power. This party enjoys a lot of legitimacy, and they might win one or two elections and then decide that they don't want to hold elections anymore. Sometimes political competition within these regimes is institutionalized and permitted within the party, and this enables some accountability. So some communist parties, for instance, allow internal elections where you can vote between different kinds of communists. And as long as everybody is faithful to the party, this sort of limited competition provides some kind of accountability, but within a narrow scope. In one-party regimes, what you see often is that party networks run parallel to state bureaucracy. So you usually had a state bureaucracy which existed prior to the one-party state, and then you have party networks that arise where the party has regional affiliates and has affiliates to do particular types of jobs that often parallel what's going on in the state. And this can be somewhat inefficient, but one advantage is that in the one-party regime, this party network can provide feedback mechanisms on how policies are doing. Generally, there is some openness to, if not openly challenge policies, then at least provide suggestions for improvement. Finally, you have personalist or personalistic regimes. These are usually associated with a phenomenon called patrimonialism or clientelism, where legitimacy is based, or political legitimacy is based on the exchange of favors between a patron and a client. The dictator tends to weaken existing institutions and makes all decisions dependent on his will. In other words, it's a highly centralized form of power where the dictator takes an active hand in deciding the business of the country. The bureaucracy and other state institutions are often bypassed. They exist, but they tend to wither away because the real power is not with them. The real power is always with the dictator. So the ruler here directly takes charge. The leader then distributes available resources based on his whim or his political need. In these sorts of systems, accountability is rather rare, and economic efficiency is even rarer. The lack of information problem faced by authoritarian regimes tends to be compounded in personalistic regimes. Personalistic regimes tend to face something called the dictator's dilemma. The dictator's dilemma is the idea that no one is willing to tell the dictator any bad news for fear of the repercussions that that might produce. And as a result, the dictator can't trust anything that he's being told. He understands that no one wants to tell him the truth, and so even telling the dictator the truth is not going to be a cover or a defense, because the dictator may just not believe you. So the dictator's dilemma means that information flows even worse in personalistic regime than it does in other kinds of modernizing authoritarian regimes. A second problem with personalist regimes might be termed the economic calculation problem, or at least a version of the economic calculation problem. Good economic decision-making requires knowledge of vast amounts of detailed information about what's going on in every area of the country and how these changes would then ripple out through the economy in surprising ways. If you're interested, you can go see Alex Tabarrok's video on how chocolate turns out to be a substitute for oil. It's not obvious, but it's true. So what this means is that a spectacular amount of information is needed, and we've already seen that modernizing authoritarian regimes for a variety of ways aren't very good at collecting feedback mechanisms, or collecting feedback from their citizens. But in a personalistic regime, you also get the phenomenon that if one person's making all the decisions, that person needs to have a phenomenal amount of processing power. It needs to be able to collate hundreds, thousands, millions of data points, and that might be possible with an army of statisticians and an army of bureaucrats to kind of filter all this information. But if it's just a dictator receiving all this information, they're likely to be acting on information that's highly incomplete because no one person has the processing power to basically run an economy efficiently. So overall, the record of modernizing authoritarianism is not very good. For every success, like Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore, there are a dozen failures. Lack of accountability, lack of informational feedback mechanisms, and overall corruption make the ideal of technocracy a lot less attractive in practice than it is in theory. The record of authoritarianism in suppressing rapid wage growth has sometimes helped a country keep its exports competitive and generate large amounts of foreign exchange revenue, which then is helpful to financing development projects. But suppressing wage growth can also backfire, creating popular resentment, and it'll backfire especially strongly if that foreign revenue is wasted rather than invested, which, again, due to a lack of accountability, it often is. So many people are attracted to modernizing authoritarianism. They look at some examples like Stalin's industrialization of Russia or Park's industrialization of South Korea and says, well, look, it's possible, it's happened, so we need to recommend it. Others are going to point to brief periods of rapid growth under modernizing authoritarianism. It's always possible to find a few years of strong growth and suggest, well, if only the policies could have been continued, then it's clear that under the right conditions, modernizing authoritarianism can produce spectacular levels of growth. But I think we want to be careful about assessing the records of individual leaders or individual systems based on only a few years of data, say 10 or fewer years. I want you to imagine a thought experiment with 200 monkeys that have to pick between two packages of policies, a good package of policies and a bad package of policies. But they're monkeys, so they don't know. But if the monkeys are picking at random, then they have a 50% chance of being right. Think about what happens the first year. Well, if they have a 50% chance of being right, then the first year, 100 monkeys will see growth, and 100 monkeys will see economic decline. The second year will still be 50 monkeys that have 2 years of consecutive growth. The third year, 25 monkeys will have 3 years of consecutive growth, picking at random. The fourth year, there'll be 12 monkeys with 4 years of consecutive growth. In the fifth years, there'll be 6 monkeys with with 5 years of consecutive growth. The 7th year, there will be 3 monkeys with 7 years of consecutive growth, and so on and so forth. And by the 9th year, you'll have 1. So statistically speaking, if there's 200 countries in the world, which there are, at least 1 will have 9 consecutive years of economic growth, even if they pick their policies by trusting coin flips or monkeys. So the fact that a country experiences many years of consecutive economic growth could be a sign of good economic policy, for sure. Or it just could be a sign of randomness, in the sense that given a 50-50 shot, there's a very good chance that with 200 countries in the world, someone will experience many years of economic growth completely for random reasons. And so, in fact, if you look at 100 countries, 100 countries will have 5 years of growth sometime during those 10 years, because the country that didn't experience growth the first year could still have 5 straight years of economic growth after that. There's still a chance that that happens. The lesson here is don't read too much into small sample sizes. The fact that some regimes have done well at times does not mean that there's anything about the regime itself that fosters good policies. And so that's the advantage of our comparative method, is that we can look at many countries over many years and see what the averages are. And the averages, unfortunately, for modernizing authoritarianism, despite the theoretical attractiveness of the idea, is not terribly good.